I'm going to show you a slightly different aspect of India. So dualism or duality, I wasn't sure really in the blurb quite how we were meant to think about all this, but it does imply a contrast or an opposition between two elements, a striving or a competition. And this idea is particularly strong in Semitic traditions as a battle between principles of good and evil, and so on. But what if the better and the worse are inherent not in the soul itself, but in its relationship to other souls and its wider environment? So I'm going to talk about the Sora, who are a pre-Hindu jungle tribe in eastern India. And in the 1970s, when I first went there, they were still illiterate animists, focused on relations between the living and their ancestors. A female shaman would enter trance, leaving her body vacant for her clients, dead relatives, to talk with the living through her mouth. And you will see an example of that. So in this cosmology, there were gods who made the world long ago, but then they withdrew. They're extremely otiose. And now all illnesses and deaths are caused by dead people. Each time you fall ill, it's a reminder of your attachment to a dead person who has started to eat your soul, thereby repeating his own symptoms in you. So for simplicity, I use she for shamans and he for lay people. So people who die of smallpox reside in a place called Smallpox House, those who are killed by a leopard in Leopard House, and so on. And from there, they return as the most recent agent of that form of suffering to attack other living people who are close to them. And the cure consists in offering him the soul of a sacrificial animal as a substitute for your own, and persuading him through dialogue to leave you alone. And if this works, you recover, and if not, then you die from a repetition of his illness, and once you're dead, you will join him in the form of death which corresponds to the symptoms that you both share, and you'll start attacking other people in turn. So we can see that each dead person has a double aspect. Firstly, as a personality and a lineage ancestor, and secondly, as a member of a collective of fellow victims of a particular form of death. And the duality of the system lies in the shifting relationship between these two aspects. And I'll keep on referring really to the dynamism of all these dualities that we're coming across. So there's a close correlation between emotional distress in the mourner and the dead person's tendency to attack. At first, a dead person is trapped in the form of his death. And over several years, the living mourners persuade him to shift from being an aggressive agent of death to becoming a protective ancestor. And between them, the living and the dead are constructing a shared narrative. And this narrative is developed and modified through a sequence of funeral rites and numerous rituals, cures, and so on, as the dead person continues to come and talk. In other words, to remain involved in the life of the descendants. And specialists sing and dance to redeem him from the anti-society of his fellow sufferers and lead him into the company of his ancestors. And redeem is the regular word used for financial transactions, for redeeming a mortgage or a captive slave. And I'll come back to this word later in the context of Christian conversion. So this duality is able to absorb and use the most specific family details. So if you look at the handout you've got in front of you, the first few lines are about some family matter, some missing piece of jewellery after the cremation of this little girl and so on. But you can see, as it goes on, the living people are more and more concerned that she's going to perpetuate the format of her death on others. She died of leprosy, don't come and make it happen to others. And she says, well, it was passed on to me, and it's a chain of constant repetition, and that's just the way things are. So I would like to show you a quick film episode. You will see two shamans sitting side by side. One is a woman, one happens to be a man. They are both in trance, dead people are speaking through them, and a crowd of living people are weeping and arguing with them. Please. So these are the two shamans. These are offerings, these are the possessions of the dead who have a great craving for materiality. So there's a dead person speaking. Thank you. So there is a range of pairings, parallels, and binary contrasts going on here. The Sora have a detachable soul, which was mentioned, I noticed, in the blurb, for example, in dreams, and the shaman's trance journey is a specialized form of this, as she travels to the underworld herself and gives voice to the dead. But as for the idea of an internal split within the person, the animist Sora soul seems internally undifferentiated. There seems to be no concept of an internal core self, and any conflicts or contradictions that it experiences take place in relationships with others. It's as if everything is projected outwards into a shared interpersonal space. So in dialogues between the living and the dead, there is a mutual negotiation, as you see in that text in front of you, and a parallel evolution. The dead person's aggression and the mourner's grief are transformed together, and the final resolution will come when the dead person gives his name to a new baby among his descendants and infuses his soul force into the crops which are grown by the descendants. So there is a cyclical, we feed the dead with sacrificial blood of animals and so on, but they feed us also with the soul force of grain. And still later he will die a second death in the underworld and turn into a butterfly. And beyond the reach of any dialogue, you can't talk to a butterfly because actually there's nothing left to discuss. Now, it's revealing to contrast the Sora system with the model of bereavement in Freud's paper, Mourning and Melancholia. I notice we're going to have some psychology later, so I thought I'd put this in. Freud similarly recognizes the ambivalence in intimate relations between tenderness and aggression. But this leads him to a different duality. A bereaved person may either go into mourning, which is a normal process from which one eventually recovers, or into melancholia, in which one suffers from the same symptoms as the dead person. Now, this is extraordinary. It sounds very Sora. And the parallel between this repetition and Sora thinking is striking, except for two important points. For Freud, the choice between healthy mourning and what he calls hysterical melancholia depends on whether or not you accept the verdict of reality that the dead person no longer exists. But for the Sora, the dead person does exist as an autonomous speaking partner. This is not an either-or choice between reality and unreality, but it's a succession between two contrasting aspects of the real person. And this contrast is not so much within themselves, but in their relationship to other persons. And related to this, Freud's model depends on an internal anatomy of the psyche, in which, as he puts it, one part of the ego judges and attacks another part of the ego. So you can see for him the tension between states can't lie in an interpersonal relationship because the dead person does not exist. So now for Christian conversion. Since I first went there in the 1970s, most young Sora have become Christians. Baptists, in fact. There's no time to go into the politics of this, except to say that Christianization has enabled them to escape from an oppressive and humiliating feudal local economic regime and political regime, and given them the literacy to participate in the Indian state rather than to be its victims. Now, dialogues with the dead are now forbidden by the church because they reinforce attachment between the living and the dead, and they distract people from a proper libidinous relationship, as Freud might have called it, with God and Jesus. Illness and death are now thought to be caused by germs, insects they're called, in the blood, to be warded off by hospital medicine and Christian prayer. So depriving the dead of voice and agency releases the living from their claims, but it also leaves an explanatory gap. People keep falling ill and dying. But now this is from the will of God. But unlike ancestors, God doesn't tell us why he's doing this, why he's making these things happen. So Christians agree with animists that existence causes pain and suffering, contains it, but they shift religious energy from ancestors to the divine, from an immanent to a transcendent metaphysics. For animists, the entire cosmos is ancestorized. Ancestors are not gods, but they're our own people who feel grudges and envy and love as we talk and argue with them. Christians use the same term redemption, which actually it comes beautifully from the Greek New Testament, but they change the idea of what we are redeemed from. Ancestors redeem us from death as the price of human attachment, in a kind of animistic humanism. But Jesus redeems us from the new idea of sin, leading us outward to the idea of divinity and devotion, which was mentioned a moment ago, which also didn't exist before. And this is made possible, logically possible, by Satan, who in a new kind of duality, a very necessary one for Christianity. So Baptists create a new kind of person with a more complex internal soul, locating emotion and morality inside the person's heart and liver and various organs which are hard to translate between Greek and Sora, rather than in the interaction between persons. What was previously projected outward is now introjected inward, creating a self-conscious Baptist person who is subject to introspection and judgment and the sight of a new kind of moral responsibility. So duality shifts to the interior of the person, who becomes a microcosm of a vast duality outside of good and evil. And your soul is policed by yourself and also by the pastors and the congregation of the church. And you can see that how the religious speech shifts, the dualities of religious speech shifts from dialogues with the dead to, firstly, prayer to God and Jesus, and secondly, sermons in which knowledgeable authority figures instruct ignorant lay persons. Could we have the second film, please? Basically, he's telling us that God is not pleased with us and we're not behaving well enough. And you see a completely different kind of physicality from the embraces of the packed tight bodies of the shamanic people. The distance of the platform. So, young people have made their choice, using Christianity as a way of joining the state while also resisting its fundamentalist Hinduism. But the price is that they've had to learn a new cosmology and morality. And we can also see what is being lost. We know about endangered species and endangered languages, but what about endangered religions and spirits? The thousands of religions throughout human history are mostly unwritten and undocumented, and they leave very little trace when they disappear. So, if indigenous religions are like endemic species, then world religions like Christianity are invasive species. And Sora Christians today, they have a reduction of all their ancestors to one God, and I think it parallels their current reduction of the botanical diversity of shifting cultivation to cashew nut plantations. So there's a parallel, strangely, between monocropping and monotheism as a non-pluralist, totalizing approach to the world. So as with the loss of biodiversity, the extinction of Sora animism will be one more step in an irreversible global loss of theodiversity. I could stop there. Thank you.
Yes, in this dialogue with the dead, the game is to try to escape to being caught, and if you're caught, you're dead, and then you go on chasing other living people. Is there place for the higher self in this?
No.
No.
I don't think so. I think this sort of higher... No, I mean, it's quite clear. Obviously, it's better to be an ancestor than just to be a victim of smallpox or leprosy or something. But it's necessary to pass through it on the way. So I suppose that's the point. So if you look at the Freudian model, it offers you either or. Either you go in for normal mourning or you become a hysterical whatever. But here, everybody has to go through this first stage. You're going to be a leprosy person for a few years after you die, and you're going to keep on coming back and complaining about what happened to you and so on, and menacing other people. And you are gradually transformed into another kind of person. So all the dualism is in there, and you could call it higher or lower, but I'd prefer to avoid that sort of vertical metaphor and just say one is definitely better than the other. It's better to become an ancestor. And when you deal with ancestors, they are in the end protecting you from the attacks of more recently dead people who are still agents of death.
And then we can talk about a double, but not about a higher self.
Yes, yes. So I think that there is a double, and it becomes apparent. It can't be known until you die, because we don't know which spirit is going to get you, which illness or whatever. But once it's known, then you very clearly become a double person.
Okay. When Christianity came around, eradicating the dialogue with the dead, did it still survive in infusing itself in discrete ways into Christian creed?
These are Baptists, so they are even more militant than the missionaries, the Canadian missionaries. So the rhetoric is certainly blocking everything that reminds you of the past, the logic and the emotionality of the past and so on. So anything which does come through is presented as backsliding or the infiltration of Satan. But of course, down the road there are Catholics. And if you want to drink alcohol or smoke or fornicate, you have to go and join the Catholics because they are less rigid.
We talk about the freedom of choice in India over and over again, and this is one of the freedoms you have.
And one thing I didn't have time to say is there are other regions where people are converting to Hindu cults.